You're listening to The Dead Prussian, a podcast about war and warfare.
Imagine you own an empire. No, not that empire. No, yeah, the other one. That's the one. So the British Empire, huge, massive, made up of thousands of component parts, but one whole beast when declaring war. How do you string those component parts together to become a war machine, a unified war machine with a sense of purpose to defeat the enemy? And what if it's more than just one enemy? G'day, listeners, and welcome to the Dead Prussian podcast. I'm your host, the humblest host with the most. And thank you very much to all our supporters out there on iTunes. The reviews are fantastic. Now, those people who haven't left a review on iTunes and you listen on iTunes, please leave a review. For those listeners that listen on other podcast apps that have reviews, one, send me a note, let me know what that podcast app is, because there's a plethora of them out there, and you guys know how much I love that word. And also submit a review on there. Also, g'day to the legends. Thank you very much for your support on Patreon, and I'm hoping that you're enjoying the beginning of our next sort of mini season of episodes this year and the bonus questions that are coming your way. Work on the transcripts continues, and it won't be too much longer. How much longer? Not too much longer. Now, you heard me in a rather, let's just say, eloquent way describe an empire at war and put you right in amongst it. But that's as far as I can go, because I'm not an expert in how the British Empire dealt with its own size when confronted with a war. And if you think about it, it's like trying to control, I suppose, a football team. That's AFL, Australian Rules Football, to any of my non-Australian listeners and even the rugby-minded listeners. But a sports team, different component parts to beat the other team. That's how I think of it, but I might be wrong. So what I've done is I've found someone who knows a lot more about it. And I've decided we should talk about the British Empire in the Second World War, because that's a pretty fascinating study. And also, given the recent centenaries and everything that have been happening over the past few years, First World War scholars, your time is done. Now, my guest today is Dr. Jonathan Fennell. He's an historian and senior lecturer in Defence Studies Department at King's College London. He joined King's in 2009. Prior to this, he worked as a management consultant in the city in London. Must have been fascinating. Couldn't think of anything worse. Jonathan was awarded a doctorate in 2008 and a master's in 2003 in history from the University of Oxford after completing a history and politics degree at University College Dublin. Now that is in Ireland. That was in 2002. I'm getting to show his age here, listeners. I really enjoy doing this to my guests sometimes. He also studied history as an Erasmus scholar at Université Lumière Lyon II. I'm assuming that's how it's pronounced. And John, you don't have to jump in and correct me, because my listeners just assume I'm always right. And that was over 2000 and 2001. Jonathan is co-director of the Sir Michael Howard Centre for the History of War. Everyone should know who Sir Michael Howard is, because he had a bit to do with my favourite book. And Jonathan is also the chair of the Defence Studies Department, the MA Assessment Sub-Board, co-founder and president of the Second World War Research Group, and a member of the War Studies Research Ethics Panel. Now, that's quite a list of achievements, all of which I don't care about. I actually care about the book he wrote. Jonathan's just written and published a book called Fighting the People's War, the British and Commonwealth Armies and the Second World War. So, Jonathan, thanks for coming on the show.
Thanks for having me, Mick.
Now, Jonathan, before we start discussing your book and fighting the People's War and getting all these component parts and disparate ethnic groups all fighting for the king and queen's purpose, well, it was actually just king then. The queen was probably, she was probably a young lass at the time. I think that's the first time I've ever called the queen a young lass. Sorry to all my royalists out there. Now, before we start discussing your book and the British Empire in the Second World War, I want to know, particularly because, I'm imagining you as this high-powered management consultant in the centre of London. I'm interested in how you ended up becoming a historian at King's College London, because that's probably not the most usual path to where you are right now.
No, I suppose not. First and foremost, I'm a failed rugby player. All I ever wanted to do was play rugby as a kid. And I was good at school as well, but rugby and then ticking along maybe with my academics. So when I went to Oxford to do a DPhil, really what I went to Oxford to do was to play rugby. And by the end of that couple of years, I was kind of fairly fed up with the world of academia. And a lot of my peers were going into the city, and I said, I'll give that a crack. So I went into the city for a few years, worked as a management consultant, hated it. But I did learn a lot about, analysis and kind of quantitative approaches to addressing problems. Got sick of it, decided to jump ship, and within a week I had an interview with King's, and they have looked after me very nicely ever since. So it was a bit of a winding path, you could say.
Yeah, I actually imagine we have quite a lot of historians that have failed sportsmen. But, most of those, I'm assuming, and only a few of them actually know where I live, so I feel safe saying this, but most of those are probably because they were never actually picked for the team. So at least you got on a team. And then, management consultant, it sounds like I've got a lot of friends in that industry, but what a journey. And now it has led you to, probably your career highlight, which is appearing on the most popular podcast named after a 19th century Prussian military theorist, to talk about your book. And your book is about British and Commonwealth armies in the Second World War, and really how they fought as the British Empire. Now, can you give our listeners a little bit of a summary about, particularly, a lot of our listeners will know the ideas behind the Second World War and how it begun. Basically, giving a spoilt child everything he wanted. But how was the military and political context of this important in terms of the British and the Commonwealth armies?
Yeah, so to try and understand 1939 and 1940, everything that goes wrong right at the start of the war, we do have to rewind a little bit and look at the interwar years, and even the First World War, if you're so inclined. And so the military context certainly interested me. And the standard kind of story, right, is that the British Army and the Commonwealth armies were hidebound, conservative, they lacked creativity, and they were underfunded in the interwar period. And more recent kind of literature has started to challenge this. And so I was quite interested in getting to grips with the doctrine, so how the army was going to approach fighting, with the quality of leadership, and indeed to a certain degree with the money that was provided to the army in the interwar years. And what I found was a much more positive story in line with the kind of more recent literature. That actually British doctrine was pretty sophisticated coming up to war in 1939. What we might refer to as mission command today, right? It wasn't a million miles away from what the Germans had put in place. It was all about devolving command and control to junior officers who were, close to the action and could make decisions based on the reality rather than, individuals further from the front who might not have had such a good sense of what was going on at the battlefront. So it was pretty sophisticated stuff. David French, who any scholar of the British Army in the Second World War would have read, has kind of pointed out that the quality of leadership was probably better than what we might expect. Most of these generals who went on to fight in the Second World War were well educated, they were brave, they were capable fellows. So the kind of military and even the amount of money that was being provided to the army, while sure, okay, there was drastic cutbacks post 1918, but the army had a fair chunk of the defense expenditure in the interwar years. So kind of the doomsday kind of narrative that came out kind of post 1940 about an army that was doomed to fail as a consequence of a lack of investment and creativity in the interwar years didn't strike me as the reality when I got stuck into the reading. And the political context then becomes even more important, I think. So here's an institution that is much more capable than perhaps we remember, but the political context was fractured and difficult.
Yeah.
Memory of the First World War was still present. Memorials, vast numbers of dead. And then it's made worse by the fact that the homes fit for heroes dynamic never materializes. So there's a sense of having been left down, especially among families who'd suffered. And then to really rub it in, you have the Great Depression. Vast cohorts of the population suffering all over the Commonwealth as a consequence of this kind of dramatic and terrible economic downturn. So the socio-economic dynamic was really very problematic. And this, needless to say, had an impact on how individuals felt about the state, about their communities. And when the state then calls them up in 1939, 1940, when this great global crisis starts to develop, mobilization is a little bit laxer than we might assume. There wasn't a great rush to the colours like arguably and mythically there was in 1914. Big cohorts of the community were fairly reluctant to get involved in the second Great War, and this was especially the case in those cohorts of society that had suffered most during the Depression, right? That felt the least attachment to Britain and its empire. So French-speaking Canadians, Afrikaans-speaking South Africans were much less inclined to sign up, to get involved, than their English-speaking compatriots. And so we get this really kind of complex mix of motivations and attachments. And that leads to manpower problems over the course of the whole war. And some of the best scholars in the Second World War have said that the key limiting factor for Britain in its hour of need was manpower. There wasn't enough people. But when we think that Britain had access to an empire of over 350 million, that's a pretty hard one to get your head around,
And you mentioned that some scholarship written on the Brits in the Second World War by a Mr. French, not the French. So for those people that were a little bit skeptical about reading about the British in the Second World War from someone named French, don't worry. It's not actually a francophile take on it. Geez, that was a really bad joke. Now, the Second World War, I guess more so than the first, was because, as you mentioned, no one wanted to get involved in what happened in 1914 to 1918. Like, no one wanted that to occur again, never again, right? So therefore, when the Second World War fell upon the British Empire in a way, or some people argue the politicians sort of stumbled into it. But we're not gonna throw any blame here on the show because I try and get listeners from all camps, apart from members of the NRA. Now, this was a great crisis for the British Empire, perhaps more so than the First World War was. And it kind of seemed like the Brits ended up fighting on all fronts. And when I say this, ladies and gents, we've just got to remember how vast British control was still around the world. How many operational theatres did the Brits actually find themselves fighting in?
Well, think of Germany's nightmare scenario, right, of a two-front war. The Brits and its empire end up fighting effectively a four-front war. They're fighting in the Mediterranean, they're fighting in Northwest Europe eventually, they're fighting in Burma, and they're fighting, as well known, Australia and the Southwest Pacific area. Yeah. I mean, it's a vast, vast commitment, a global war, a multi-front global war. And as a consequence, the complexities of waging this war effectively were pretty immense.
And how did they must have had to adapt, because for an empire that size, especially in the 18th century, there'd be a war of focus, I suppose, and what I like to call policing actions elsewhere in other colonies. Kind of this is my understanding. The British Empire of the 1800s. Sudan's your main focus right now, and you've just got some other sort of lower level conflicts happening in some of the other colonies where you need to put down a little bit of unrest. But this is different. This is the empire at war on four fronts. The armies, you said they had good doctrine, smart generals. How did they adapt to fighting the war they're in? Because I tell you what, if I'm fighting in Europe, that's very different to the way I'm fighting in North Africa, and also very different to the way I'm fighting in Burma. And going through the jungles of New Guinea, probably not the same, and definitely not the same as Africa, but still not the same as Burma. So how did the British and Commonwealth armies as this behemoth adapt to the war they were in?
Yeah, so I mean, start off, you need a team, you need allies, and as you quite rightly point out, you need to be extraordinarily creative. So what goes wrong? So Britain fights to the last Frenchman in a way in France in 1940. It's the BEF, the British Expeditionary Force, is a relatively small part of this Allied army that gets roundly beaten in 1940 by the Wehrmacht.
Yeah, and that's in that documentary Dunkirk, right?
That documentary Dunkirk. So I mean, in many ways, we can can put your hands up and say, it's not our fault, Gov. It's the French who fell apart in 1940 to a degree.
Yeah.
That's not to say that the British Army wasn't stunned and disappointed by the performance of the BEF.
Yeah.
And reports that kind of started to circulate after the disaster, after the evacuation at Dunkirk, it's amazing how similar the narrative that comes out of them is to what the New Zealanders are trying to work out after, say, the disaster at Crete. What they're saying after the disasters in the desert in 1942, when Tobruk falls and the Gazala position falls to pieces, and what they're saying in the jungles of Malaya after the fall of Singapore. There's this solid and consistent narrative that emerges, that there's kind of two interrelated dynamics that are meaning that everything goes wrong. One is training. So the Commonwealth mobilizes late because there's this hope that Hitler can be appeased, and when that falls to pieces, only late in the day does the Commonwealth mobilize. So the forces that are suddenly created are undertrained citizen armies. So they're not the professionals that we might think about in today's armed forces. These are amateur soldiers.
Yeah.
And there are these morale problems because the very individuals who are asked to fight are in most cases, or who are willing to fight, are in most cases those who also suffered during the interwar years. So one of the kind of the nice little management consulting type things I was able to do with the book is to do social class surveys of the British and Commonwealth forces. So these vast spreadsheets to try and work out who fought. And, were they rich? Were they poor? Were they bankers? Were they salesmen? Were they whatever? And, what came out is that these were not representative armies. These weren't, lawyers didn't tend to get stuck into the front line, nor indeed did bankers. It tended to be the lower middle classes and the upper working classes who fought. And these guys had an awfully rough time in the interwar period. So you have an undertrained army, which is moderately motivated, not on fire, against a German armed forces, which is pretty well trained and which is absolutely ideologically certain and great conviction, takes risks and fights with really, really serious determination. And so it's an uneven fight, and we get we get fairly whipped in the first few years of the war, as we well know.
And to adapt to that, I guess what we see is the Second World War, much like the First, and it's probably not focused as much in terms of pop culture, mainly because Rowan Atkinson hasn't done a series of Blackadder on it. But the First World War is known as a meat grinder. Haig, the butcher, rightly or wrongly, the tactics that were done, lots of lives lost in these frontal assaults. The Second World War wasn't a clean affair. It was a bit of a meat grinder in the way that it was fought, especially now that industrialized warfare was really coming into its own. First World War showed its potential. Second World War, I think, realized that potential, especially in an attritionist way. When did the attritionist approach start to be questioned by the British and Commonwealth armies?
Yeah, so, cracking stuff. So everything's going wrong. And all of a sudden, there is a turnaround, right? Thank God. Montgomery rocks up in the desert. He looks at this undertrained, moderately motivated citizen army, and he decides to rein everything in. He's going to get away with this system of devolved command and control, mission command, as we refer to it today.
Yeah.
And he's going to centralize command and control on his being. Everything, in a sense, would go through him. And he'd make massive use of the vast amount of material that was now available to the Empire because the Americans were in the war too.
Yeah.
And so 8th Army, blasts the Africa Corps and German-Italian forces in North Africa out of the El Alamein positions, and starts this grinding approach. It's the colossal cracks approach. It's not dynamic. It's not quick. It's methodical. and it gets the job done slowly but surely.
Yeah.
Problem is, if you're running out of human beings, that's maybe not the best way to fight.
Yeah.
And if your kind of geopolitical situation requires a rapid end to this war, for the war still to be for the second half of the 20th century still to be a British story, like the first half of the 20th century had been, the war needs to be won quickly by the British and Commonwealth forces.
Yeah.
If it's won by the Americans and the Soviets, which, let's face it, what ends up happening, the second half of the 20th century becomes a American and Soviet story.
Yeah.
So the hope is in 42, 43, or even in early 1944, the British and Commonwealth armies can get the job done. But this attritional approach, which was a direct result of all the problems faced in the early years of the war, just kind of precludes that from happening. You can't win quickly with this type of warfare.
Yeah.
And so as 8th Army grinds its way up through the mountains of Sicily, up the spine of Italy, again, very mountainous terrain, it's slow, it's horrendous, it's casualty intensive, it's nasty stuff. And so it's not really getting the job done in the way that British strategists might have hoped. Now the story in the jungle is a little bit different, right? Massed firepower works pretty effectively in a flat desert where targets present themselves and can be easily destroyed by artillery. In the jungle, command and control is almost impossible, right? You can hardly see in front of your nose.
Yeah.
So the response, which was really in many ways led by the Australians, was to go further into this devolved command and control process and really, really embrace mission command. But to do this, they needed to address the two fundamental weaknesses to the British and Commonwealth armies, training and morale.
Yeah.
And so the Australians in particular just, take on this training idea and run with it. And they set up these training establishments in the jungle in Queensland, and they train and they train again. And Indian officers come and visit, and they watch and they learn. And the Indian Army itself starts to kind of recognize the fundamentals of jungle warfare are different to the fundamentals of warfare in the plains of France, or warfare in the desert, or warfare in the mountains, and starts to come up with many of the same solutions as well to the Australians. So you get this, you pointed to this, Mick, right? This complex series of problems, different terrains and environments, and the British and Commonwealth armies have to come up with different solutions to each environment. And so it's really a dynamic story of creativity, imagination, teamwork, sharing of ideas. So from disaster to, we're starting to get into some sort of victory now, right? We're in 1943 and 1944.
Yeah.
And a lot of that is due to creativity and imagination.
And so we've talked. So this transformation that we're talking about right now, they start to adapt, and we talk about the influences, the forced adaptation, particularly the jungle warfare. You mentioned some of the schools here in Australia, some of which we still have bases at in Australia. Lovely country there if you want to meet a few snakes. But it seems to have sort of paid off for the Brits and the add-ons, and being a native add-on myself. So we know that it became the Soviet and US back half of the century. But it seems that the British and Commonwealth armies started to get it right in the end. How exactly did they get it right? And I guess how far did they go before they culminated?
So let's go back to the West. So Montgomery leaves the Mediterranean in 1943 to go back home to prepare 21st Army Group for the assault on Fortress Europe, so Normandy and D-Day. And he is, he's pretty fed up. He writes, we've made a right mess of this. And he starts to think again about how his armies should fight. He starts to think again about devolving command and control back down to divisional and brigade commanders. Now, he doesn't manage to put all that right in time for Normandy, for reasons that I go into in great depth in the book. But by the time Normandy finishes, he is, and Market Garden, listeners will be, I'm sure, familiar with the kind of big airborne operation around Market Garden. By the time both of those have finished, he is now thoroughly fed up. It's been slow, horrendous, casualty-intensive fighting all through the Normandy campaign.
Yeah.
And he decides then to change again, to change approach. I mean, so, we're told never change a winning team. Well, he decides to kind of change a winning team. Yeah, I mean, but to be honest, right? If you're interested in sport, there's no great team that's lasted decades that doesn't continually adapt to the situation they're faced. There's a
Yeah.
requirement to look at what's in front of you, right? And Monty, in fairness to him and those around him, recognized that colossal cracks, while it was getting the job done at a slow pace, wasn't really, doing what Britain wanted, which was to get the war done quickly with the British and Commonwealth armies at the center of the story. So he goes back in many ways to this interwar doctrine, this mission command focus, giving more responsibility to those closer to the front. And what you see is a gradual and then quite dramatic transformation in the performance in the armies in the West. Initially, these armies are up against very difficult terrain. Think of the Siegfried Line defending the western approaches to Germany. Think of, again, the Apennines in Italy. But once they're through the very difficult terrain, operations are much more successful. And in April 1945, 8th Army just makes a mockery of the German army in Italy in a stunning battle of fire maneuver. And in many ways, the crossing of the Rhine is similarly impressive.
Yeah.
Back east, it's more a story of refinement, right? Initially, this really creative approach, focusing on training and morale, leads to better performance in the jungles in 1943 and 1944. But then by the time you get to 1945, say the Indian Army is now fighting in the kind of flatter plains of Burma on the road towards Mandalay and down to Rangoon. And they're able to kind of use mission command and speed and all the lessons they've learned from jungle warfare in a more kind of benign environment. And just possibly Operations Capital and Extended Capital are probably two of the most impressive operations any student of history can engage with. So mass maneuver, clever stuff, great determination and speed. And they destroy an enormous Japanese army in the space of a number of months. So the transformation is complete. It's impressive. It's a mix of high levels of morale, high levels of creativity, clever doctrine, good kit. The problem is, Mick, it's all a bit late.
Yeah.
Because now it's the American century. It needed to happen in 43 or maybe 42 or even earlier. But that doesn't take away from the extraordinary institutional turnaround.
Yeah, I mean, taking third prize in the big great power competition is probably better than getting the most improved trophy.
It's certainly better than losing, isn't
it? Let's be honest. I've got a few most improved trophies. I know exactly what they are to all my former coaches. Thanks very much. Look, John, I'd love to talk all night with you about this, because the Second World War, and particularly Commonwealth armies in the Second World War, was something that I find extremely interesting for obvious reasons. Listeners, listen to my accent. I'd also love to find out whether or not you build yourself management consulting on your own book, but we won't do that. What we're going to do is, for those listeners that support the show with a little bit of tin, we'll go to the bonus question, and then for those listeners who keep their tin in their pockets rather than share the love, we will go to the final question. So I'll just give a little bit of a pause so that I can do my sloppy editing work. Now, Jonathan, my final question is one that I ask of all guests. It relates to our mission on the show, to define war in as many ways as possible, just like Big Carl, the dead Prussian himself, so that we can continue the conversation about one of society's most costly phenomenons. Now, I ask each guest to finish the sentence, war is. So now, I ask you to finish the sentence, war is.
A battle of wills. I mean, I've always understood it as, a group of people trying to impose their will on another group of people by use of force.
That's good. I like it. It's got a bit of whale. It's got a bit of Big Carl in there. Got a bit of Thucydides in there. That's good. I'm sure the listeners will like it, and I'm not sure we've had it expressed quite that way. So you might even be up on originality cards, not in history. I mean, just in the most popular podcast named after a 19th century Prussian military thinker. Jonathan, thank you very much for coming on the show.
My absolute pleasure. Thanks for having me, Mick.
And listeners, please help me thank Jonathan by buying his book, Fighting the People's War, British and Commonwealth Armies and the Second World War, as published by Cambridge University Press. Now, I know some of you listeners already have his book, So I'm going to ask you to do something that you probably haven't done, and you can still support Jonathan. Buy his book again. That's it. That's it. What I need you to do, listeners. So just buy another copy. I don't care if you give it away. Jonathan will probably care if no one reads that copy, but still, just buy the book. Because the more sales, the more likely he is to convince the people at CUP to publish the next one. You can also support Jonathan if you don't want to spend your money on copies of the same book. You can follow him on Twitter and you can engage in conversation with him. That's probably just as supportive for him, although it will not feed his children. And he is at Jonathan Fennell on Twitter. That's pretty easy. That's no weird punctuation like mine, so that's actually quite good. Now, listeners, if you want to support the show, jump on Patreon. I've changed the reward scheme simply because our publishing and production schedule at the moment is a little bit haywire. So what we are doing is we're releasing episodes in bursts as opposed to our standard fortnightly method that we've had for the past 3 years. External factors are causing this for us, listeners, but we will still get you the Dead Prussian when we can. What that means for the Patreon legends is that it's a flat rate. It's $5 at the moment, and you will get bonus questions with each episode that comes out and access to the transcripts once the transcripts are in a publishable format, which we're working on now to get both looking right, being in a usable format for you so that you can reference them in all those wonderful essays you're doing or chapters, and well, mainly just your tweets is probably where you're going to reference them. But if you want to support us, that's the changes to the new subscription program. However, until next time, listeners.
With Carl's wife and the publisher of On War. Join the conversation with us on Twitter at Dead Prussian Pod, on Facebook at the Dead Prussian page, or on our website www.thedeadprussian.com. All show notes for this episode, as well as copyright information, can be found on the website. The Dead Prussian podcast is written, produced and hosted by Mick Cook. The music used throughout is Caught in the Beat by Broke for Free and is used under a Creative Commons Attribution license. All opinions expressed by individuals on the podcast are those of the individual and not necessarily representative of any other organisation.